Welcome back to the Lanterne Rouge YouTube channel. Once again, I am called upon to discuss a Peter Sagan sprint relegation. A reminder of the rule from our favourite book, the UCI Road Rules. Riders shall be strictly forbidden from deviating from the lane they selected when launching into the sprint and in so doing endangering others. And if you want to listen to my immediate reaction and long form reaction to what happened last night, you can check it out on the Lanterne Rouge Cycling Podcast. Link is in the description. But onto the sprint, let's set the scene 837 metres out. It's no good just looking at the point of contact without looking at what happened beforehand and how the sprint developed. You can see Peter Sagan is fighting for the wheel of Sam Bennett in the green jersey there. He's just been dropped off by Daniel Oss, who's the Boro rider on the bottom of the screen. B&B Hotels, they are the two riders with, I think, Kevin Retzer on the front, who's just behind Greg van Avermaet, the CCC, the rider in the orange jersey. They've kind of been detached from their sprinter, Brian Coquard, who's on the right-hand side in that light blue jersey. And there's two sprint trains right now on the left and the right-hand side of the road. You've got Lotto Soudal leading out. I assume it's Roger Kluger on the top left for Lotto Soudal, and Edvald Boasson-Hagen, the NTT rider, on his wheel. Jesper Stuyven and Luka Mezgec are the riders fighting for the NTT rider's wheel. Third wheel, Stuyven is leading out Mads Pedersen in the World Championships jersey. Fourth wheel, I assume it's Elia Viviani, the Cofidis rider, to his left. And Wout van Aert's actually eating quite a bit of wind in the middle, the yellow jersey for Jumbo-Visma. He's got Trentin to his left and Caleb Ewan quite a way back. But sitting quite nicely, a good draft there between Wout van Aert and Matteo Trentin. So Sagan in quite a good position actually. He's got options to his left, options to his right, and he's on the wheel of the rider who won the stage yesterday and who's wearing the points classification jersey. So all looking good for Sagan so far, except just 25 metres later, he actually gets beaten to the wheel of Bennett or pushed off it a bit by Brian Coquard, and you begin to see the NTT rider and Stuyven move over to the right-hand side, and these two sprint trains are going to merge. 130 metres later, with 684 metres to go, Sagan has had to drop back a few wheels actually, and now he's properly off the wheel of Sam Bennett. He's got his wheel sort of on the wrong side of Brian Coquard, and he has to slow pedal for a bit or stop pedaling to then bring his wheel back to the left-hand side of Coquard's wheel, so he's able to go left if he needs to. But at this point, it's already looking like a risk for Sagan that he will get boxed in with Stuyven on his left. 30 metres later, you can see the B&B train has their last lead-out man on the front. Stuyven starts to move up strongly to the middle and to the left, where all this space is around. It has to go wide around Kevin Retzer, because Retzer actually drifts a little bit to the middle line as he finishes his pull. Mads Pedersen, you see here in the rainbow bands, tries to follow his man Stuyven. He's blocked a little bit by Mezgec, but still manages to squeeze through. And Sagan is in quite a nice position actually. He then has space to his left, and he's got wheels to follow to his right if they do accelerate. 40 metres later, Stuyven realises he's gone too far to the left and Mads Pedersen's not quite on his wheel. He looks back to see where Pedersen is and then goes back from the right-hand side of the road as we look at it, back to the left-hand side in front of Mads Pedersen. There's still the lead out from B&B on the barriers to the left-hand side. But jumping forward about 230 metres, it was a holding pattern for quite a while. Everyone assembled. You see Wout van Aert beginning to sneak up and move up on the left-hand side here as we look at it on the barriers. Sagan is this rider right in the middle between Mezgec and I think Coquard. It's still the B&B lead-out man and Stuyven on the front. Stuyven's about to commence his last kick. He goes left because he has to go around the B&B rider, and Bennett and Co and Sagan, they all follow his lead out, and Boasson-Hagen as well. You see Bennett, Sagan there now in the middle of the road, and Wout van Aert, he drifted across a little bit with Venturini and Hofstetter on his wheel. I think Cees Bol back there as well. Caleb Ewan quite a way back, you can see there, but still getting a good draft. Stuyven, who was in the middle, when he finishes his pull, he drifts across to this left-hand side of the road as we look at it, maybe trying to give Mads Pedersen one bike width to his right-hand shoulder to go through that gap and opening up a bit to his left shoulder. Both Wout van Aert and Bennett have just about enough space to squeeze through this gap with 250 metres to go. Now going to the overhead shot, you can see there is a fair amount of space here. You see where Peter Sagan is. He's actually right on the wheel, even to the left-hand side of the wheel of Sam Bennett, on the left-hand side of this solid white line. And Clement Venturini is smack bang on Wout van Aert's wheel. As Wout van Aert kicks quite early, you see that Bennett hasn't full-on started sprinting yet. It was like 250, 260 metres to go, so quite a way out. Venturini is fighting with Sagan for Wout van Aert's wheel. Sagan was trying to follow Wout van Aert right now through this gap, but Venturini fights him off. You see Hofstetter trying to come through on Venturini's wheel. Sagan chose at this point to leave the wheel of Sam Bennett, who was in the middle of the road, and with space to the left-hand side, given that Stuyven is actually going to drop back because he was leading out for Pedersen. You see all this space to the left where Mezgec, Gibbons, Boasson-Hagen are. With Venturini having squeezed past Sagan and got onto Wout van Aert's wheel on the right-hand side, notice where Wout van Aert is on the barriers. Do you see a gap between Wout van Aert and the barriers right now that anyone could squeeze through? Answer no. Sagan then pinches off Hofstadter a little bit and fights for Venturini's wheel. Hofstadter complained on Twitter later about this, but I don't really agree with him actually. I don't have too much of a problem with Sagan fighting for Venturini's wheel. Hofstadter was trying to do kind of the same thing that Sagan did later to Wout van Aert, squeeze through a gap that wasn't really there. Sagan had his wheel in front of him initially. I know Sagan moved across a little bit, but I didn't think that was too bad what Sagan did to Hofstadter. Bennett still hasn't launched yet at this point. You see Caleb Ewan coming into the bottom of the screen. Sagan obviously sees this right-hand path past Venturini and Wout van Aert as his way to actually try and win the stage, because he's got, once again, his wheel on the right-hand side of Venturini, so he can't really push into Bennett and go up the left-hand side where the solid white line is. When he goes past Venturini, he actually does make contact, I think, with his right thigh. He flares the elbow a little bit and does give Venturini a little bit of a nudge, nothing too crazy. There was just enough space there, but you've got to remember at this point as well, people saying that Wout van Aert deviated from his line or whatever. A, no, he didn't deviate from his line, and we'll look at how the road bends later, but B, these barriers were kind of moving in and out a little bit. So without Wout van Aert really moving from his line, the width between him and the barriers was changing just because of the barriers weren't exactly straight. Sagan has a decision to make. Can he squeeze past Wout van Aert through this right-hand side? Is there enough space? Wout van Aert has his left pedal stroke down right now, so his body weight's a little bit more to the left. You see the angle of his bike. See how his saddle is tilted over to the left-hand side. And people that are always talking about, oh, Wout van Aert deviated on Twitter. The lanes they have, there has to be a little bit of wiggle room in the lanes. When you look in athletics on the track, the lanes aren't exactly the width of a human's shoulders. There is, I don't know how much bigger than a human they are, but they're a little bit bigger to allow for some natural movement from side to side. And the same thing obviously should apply for sprinting. They're sprinting out of the saddle at 70 k's an hour, putting down like 1500, 1800 watts. Of course, the bike is going to move from side to side a little bit. It's whether you really change the direction of the bike. But at this point, Sagan had mentally committed, I think, to going through this gap. You can see when you just change to the front-on shot that the gap doesn't look even as big as it does in the overhead shot. You can see the feet of the hoardings jutting out a little bit. That's why riders don't like to get too close to the hoardings. You obviously also see the selfie stick poking out. That's another reason why the riders don't try and ride like exactly flush with the barriers, which is what people were saying Wout van Aert should have done, which would have prevented all of this. That being said, I don't think at all that Sagan was trying to avoid this selfie stick or get out of the way of it. I doubt he even saw it, and even if he did, he probably would have ridden straight through it. But you can see how the road is bending slightly to the right. And even if the finish is kind of straight, you can see that it's a natural reaction for the riders to try and follow the flow of those lines. You see the angle of Bennett, he's following that line. Wout van Aert is about to follow that line as well. Same with Pedersen. But anyway, Sagan commits to going through the gap. There's not too much space. He probably could have squeezed through, to be honest, if he ducked his left-hand shoulder in. If you look at what Pascal Ackermann did in Tirreno Adriatico Stage 1 through a very, very small gap as well, he just stopped pedaling for a bit, used his momentum and slid through like that and ducked his shoulder in. Whereas Sagan does the opposite. He angles his body into Wout van Aert and uses his head and elbow to push Wout van Aert off his line. But after that initial push, I want you to mark down this moment too. Yes, he's pushed Wout van Aert off the barriers just a little bit, but not too much. And now Sagan, he has enough space. He can probably go past Wout van Aert on the right-hand side. He's got enough space to do that. You see the line of Bennett and Ewan. Bennett's quite close to that white line. And yet Sagan keeps pushing Wout van Aert to the left-hand side and actually goes across to the end of that white line. You see his flared elbow and the direction of Sagan. This is when Wout van Aert was about to try and throw his bike for the line. Sagan kept ducking in on Wout van Aert, and it's most obvious in this front-on shot where he's come off the barrier quite a bit, more so than was necessary for him to actually create that space. You look at the angle of Wout van Aert's bike, which was on that white line trying to follow the bend around the road, and you look at the angle of Sagan across Wout van Aert. That's the line deviation as well. Long story short, do I think Sagan should have been relegated for the way he sprinted yesterday in stage 11? Yeah, I think so. I mean, committed to this gap in this image here where there really isn't one at all. Wout van Aert hadn't deviated from his line. He has to, Sagan, account for like natural movement of Wout van Aert from side to side as he's sprinting, and he knows that's going to be a tight gap. He commits to it anyway, and as the gap narrowed because of maybe fluctuations in the barriers, he doesn't back off a little bit either and let the sprint go. He's like, I'm going to barge through and push Wout van Aert off the line anyway. I don't think it was a certainty that if Sagan hadn't done this, he would have crashed. There was certainly plenty of opportunities for him to back out of the sprint, just the way Hugo Hofstadter did the same when Sagan came across him to fight for Clement Venturini's wheel. It was like 350 meters to go. But I think the most damning part for me is at this point where he has cleared enough space for himself. You'd say he's made enough safe space for him to now go straight to the line, and he keeps ducking in on Wout van Aert all the way to the line. That's a line deviation in itself. I think it was him using his head and pushing Wout van Aert out of the way that was the actual reason why he got relegated. And this is terrible for his green jersey hopes. You see La Flamme Rouge put out a tweet that he got a 500 Swiss franc fine and lost 13 points in the points classification. He's like 60 or 70 points behind Sam Bennett now. You can see the reasons why here in the UCI regulations for, the sanctions they have to hand out when a rider has deviated from their line in a sprint or has conducted an irregular sprint. I can't do the quick maths, so I assume it's all correct. And Wout van Aert, on ITV Sport, if you go and check out, it's not geo-blocked, that video, a lot of people saying, oh, well, Wout van Aert, he's a racer, he understands the risks, etc. That's literally not what he said in the post-race interview. He said, yeah, that was really sketchy, I was scared, and it's a pretty dangerous move, and it doesn't really matter how good your bike handling is, not really something you should be pulling off in the Tour de France. And I know a lot of people come out of the woodwork, probably have only just tuned into the Tour de France as the first World Tour race that they're watching this year, or first pro cycling event, even former riders, and they're saying, back in my day, we used to carry nunchucks and a samurai sword in sprints, and it was way better. People were tougher then, and we used to beat the shit out of each other with those nunchucks in the finale, and that's when men were men and sprints were sprints, and now all these riders are really soft. And to them, I say we've got the UFC for watching people fighting. Yes, sprints, there is jostling. Mads Pedersen was jostling in this image with Mezgec to get back to Sturven's wheel. Sturven was jostling for Mezgec at the start. A little bit of elbow rubbing to create space, not a problem. But coming underneath a rider at 65, 70 kilometers an hour on the barriers and then launching your body into them to move them off their line, potentially dominoing into other riders, not something I need to see, and not something that adds any additional excitement for me in professional cycling sprints. But hey, maybe I'm just a snowflake millennial. I'm sure you'll all let me know in the comments down below what your opinion is on the Sagan relegation. Obviously, Benji and I on the Lanterne Rouge Cycling Podcast do daily Tour de France recaps. They get released like 2-3 hours after the stage finishes each day, sometimes sooner. And for all the interesting stages in this year's tour, I do analysis videos at ITV Sport. You can already see the backlog or catalogue of them over there. But I hope you're well. Ciao.